Benedicite Dominus, and welcome to question 35 of the secundae of St. Thomas Aquinas of the Summa Theologica. The topic for this lecture is sloth, and I am Dr. Thibault. So we are still under the section of charity, right, the theological virtue, and we are looking at the vices associated with charity, right, contrary to charity. First, we're doing the internal, which is hatred, sloth, and envy, and then we get into the external vices as a result of their contrast, their contrariness with charity. So, first, these are only 4 articles, so they're nice and short. The first one is sloth a sin? Right? Is it sloth a sin? Now, sloth is acedia. That's what we're talking about with sloth in the Latin, and it's dealing with a type of sorrow, or sometimes people look at it as laziness, right? So it has a lot of depictions, sloth. So we'll look at the Thomistic perspective. So acedia is an oppressive sorrow, which, to wit, so weighs upon man's mind that he wants to do nothing. Sounds like depression, right? So it's an oppressive sorrow which weighs on the mind, which makes the person want to do nothing. This is according to St. John Damascene. St. Thomas also describes it as a sluggishness of mind which neglects to being good. Right? So sluggish mind neglects to being good. Yeah, so what's important, though, is that we know that this is not the same as depression. Now, they might not have thought that way in the 13th century, 14th century, but today we would not, clearly no type of mental illness or psychological disorder is, strictly speaking, it wouldn't be the proper subject matter for being sinful, right? You wouldn't be sinful if you were schizophrenic. You wouldn't be sinful if you have depression, right? It's a passion, right? It's something that has overcome you. It's not something that you are morally responsible for. If it goes untreated, now that you might be responsible for not getting proper treatment, but you're not responsible for having something happening to you. Now, we'll get into later on degrees, but right off the bat we want to say just initially that no type of mental disorder or mental things like depression are sinful at all, right? That wouldn't be right. So the second would be is sloth a special vice, right? Is it special, right? And so often the answer is usually yes. Sometimes it's no, but it's usually yes. If the question is this a special kind of vice? Meaning, does it apply to everything, right? Are all vices have sloth in it, right? Is this kind of universally applied to all? Or is this specific to a particular type of virtue, right? Is it special? Is it specially contrary to a special type of virtue? And St. Thomas looked at it in 2 ways. One, sloth is sorrow of a spiritual good. If we take spiritual good in a general way, sloth is not a special type of vice, right? So if it's just against the spiritual good, right, that's general, right, then it would be also a general vice, right? General good, general vice. Now, it can be a special vice, though. So if sorrow is aimed towards the divine good, right, not just a spiritual good, but the divine good, right, then sorrow in the divine good about which charity rejoices belongs to a special vice, so it's called sloth. So what is the proper response to the divine good? Well, it should be joy, right? If you go back to the virtues associated with with charity, right? What's the response? Well, it should be joy, it should be peace, it should be mercy, and this is the proper divine responses. So if your response to this divine good is sorrow, then that is a particular deformity, right? This particular disorderedness to that, right? Because it's not the proper response. Like people yelling your birthday, surprise, happy birthday, and you're sad, right? This doesn't make any sense. You should be happy. People are celebrating for you, right? Okay. Is sloth a mortal sin, right? And this then depends, right? So mortal sins are called mortal because they destroy the spiritual life, which is the effect of charity, whereby God dwells within. So if somebody has a mortal sin, you have in some way destroyed or severed charity, right? Love of God and love of neighbor through the love of God, right? So if that's what mortal sin is in all cases, right? So if we're dealing with justice and fortitude, right? If we're looking at with vices associated with those virtues, it would be still a violation of charity, right? So since we are talking about the proper response to divine good should be joy and peace, right? We're talking directly about charity. So that which goes directly against charity would also then almost very necessarily be a mortal sin, right? It would be contrary to charity, right? Again, the proper response to charity is joy. Your response to charity is sorrow. That's contrary to charity, right? You should be experiencing joy. Now, the proper effect of charity is joy in God, right? Already said that. So we can look at this in two ways. Now, this is good for discussion because it's not entirely clear what's meant, right? And it's not, some things are more obvious than others. So, in terms of sloth being a venial sin, well, we're talking about the sensuality alone, right? The senses, by reason of the opposition of the flesh to the spirit. That's all he's saying. The opposition of the flesh to the spirit. In that case, it's a venial sin. It'd be nice if he gave an example, right? What specifically does this mean? Now, as a mortal sin, it must be held to the light of reason, right? And you still go contrary to reason. So, mortal sin, in this regard, it says, which is reason, which is consent, is the dislike, horror, and detestation of the divine good on account of the flesh utterly prevailing over the spirit. So, it is the flesh utterly prevailing over the spirit, right? You have chosen it, right? That's what comes from the mortal sin. So, it's a Feast of the Immaculate Conception, a holy day of obligation, and you say, I'm not going to Mass. Or it's Good Friday and your friend cooks up red meat or something like that, and you go, I'm eating it, right? I'm eating it. It is the flesh utterly prevailing over the spirit, right? It's just my body wants it, I want it, I'm going to do it regardless of what the spirit says, right? Regardless of what the spiritual reality might be. This is different than the venial sin, where it could just be some type of low-level laziness, right? Because sloth is often depicted with laziness, right? You're going to pray, right? You've committed to pray, and you fall asleep, right? Or you've left things to the last moment, and now you don't have the strength to do it anymore, right? This is a little bit different, right? It's not, you haven't chosen it. You've made, it's led to bad decisions, but it's not something you have outright chosen, right? It hasn't come to the light of reason. Now, in terms of it being a capital vice, right, the last section. Now, a capital vice is, we would think of it under our contemporary understanding, we would say, is it one of the 7 deadly sins, right? One of the 7 deadly sins, as pointed out by St. Gregory, right, in his treatise on morals. Now, a capital vice is like a mother. It leads to other vices, right? So, is this a vice which then has daughters, right? Does it give birth to other vices, right? By participating in sloth, are you starting down a road which now includes many other vices? And St. Thomas says yes, which makes sense, because if St. Gregory said it, St. Thomas isn't going to go against him. He says, now, just as we do many things on account of pleasure, both in order to obtain it and through being moved to do something under the impulse of pleasure, so again we do many things on account of sorrow, right? So as a result of experiencing pleasure, we can sometimes go in the wrong direction, right? In terms of food, drink, and sex, right? Things that require temperance, this would be out of pleasures, but also out of sorrows. We can also this would usually be the sins associated with fortitude, right? Abandoning the faith and running away from martyrdom, running away from the truth when things get difficult, right? Sorrow and pain can also cause future sins, right? So, and some of these, as pointed out by St. Gregory, are malice, spite, faint-heartedness, despair, and sluggishness, right? So these can all derive their origins from sloth. Right? Some of them are more obvious than others, like faint-hearted, right? If you're just in sorrow, or just your response to everything, right? Even the divine goodness is sorrow. This is kind of Eeyore-like, right? Kind of Eeyore-like, or despair, sluggishness. That makes sense, right? That some of them, like malice or spite, might be a little bit more, you have to think a little bit more outside the box for that too, because it doesn't sound like laziness, right? It comes from, it's a little bit, it feels like the sin of Cain and Abel, right? There's a little bit of, I know that's envy, but right, I could do more, I didn't do more, and I'm angry at others who did, right? So it's like if you had a group project for school and somebody else did all the work and you show up and they say to you, I did this whole project by myself and you didn't help me at all. And your response to being attacked, right, even if it might be true, could be to attack back, right? Malice or spite, right? How dare you accuse me of being lazy? How dare you accuse me of not doing my part, right? I did something, we make up excuses, right? So this can be a response to the truth, right, of our own sloth, right? We might respond to accusations in terms of malice and spite. Okay, so this is, again, a very short section. So in conclusion, sloth is a sin, acedia. It is a special vice in terms of it being directly related to charity, right? So if in response to charity, we should experience joy, peace, and mercy. If instead we experience sorrow, that is a disordered response, right? If it's just your experience, you choose sorrow, the flesh does not battle for the spiritual goods, right? You just kind of get comfortable in eating your ice cream, eating your potato chips, and watching TV. It might be a venial sin, right? If it has been raised to reason and you have still chosen it, right, in the light of reason, now it might be a mortal sin, right, that you've chosen this over the spiritual goods. And lastly, it is a capital vice, because sloth could lead to future vices, right? It's not the end, it's the beginning of a road down in the wrong direction. So This is Sloth. I hope you enjoyed this short section.